All monsters are mirrors, or at least that is what we're led to believe in Paul Tremblay's novel Horror Movie. Sometimes that mirror reflects directly on society, culture, history, or moral norms. In meta-horror, however, horror is presented as conscious of itself as horror. That is, meta-horror is horror that reflects on what is presented to us, on the audiences that consume these images, and on the genre as a whole, written, visual, or otherwise. Scholar David Church, in Post-Horror, Art, Genre, and Cultural Evaluation, frames meta-horror as post-horror so that it, quote, operates similarly to aesthetic labels like postmodern or post-punk and signifies a stylistic approach that attempts to both contain and move beyond the ethos of whichever existing term post modifies. In other words, post-horror moves beyond horror to enrich it, to bring a new perspective to audiences that could potentially relieve the horror or, indeed, compound it. In this episode of Horror Joy, we analyze meta-horror by discussing Paul Tremblay's Horror Movie, R.L. Stine's The Haunted Mask, and the 2011 film Cabin in the Woods. While it will be difficult to label The Haunted Mask as meta-horror, it offers a foil by which to analyze Horror Movie.
Both stories highlight the horror of masks and the rich history that masks have had in horror narratives. We see both Tremblay and Stine use masks to entertain questions of identity. Both the Thin Kid in Horror Movie and Carly Beth in The Haunted Mask literally take on the identity of the masks they wear. Tremblay and Stine engage in meta-horror by making us question whether such masks are alive, where the wearer ends and the mask begins, and even if masks are an opportunity for manipulation. Drew Goddard's film is perhaps the most explicit example of meta-horror in the last 15 years, and covers an extensive amount of ground. In part, it asks the question, what would you do if you were faced with a chance to save the world through your own suffering? It also seems to claim that horror is in need of a genre apocalypse. But does the film successfully unravel the tangled threads of our favorite tropes? Grab your coziest mask and join us as we navigate the tricky underground corridors of horror. Just try not to get lost along the way.
This is Horror Joy, a podcast celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona. Today on Horror Joy, we are talking about a few things. First, we're going to talk about The Haunted Mask, one of R.L. Stine's early Goosebumps titles. Excited to talk about that. We're going to then kind of segue, hopefully, into Horror Movie. We want to revisit Horror Movie, Paul Tremblay's new book. We talked to Paul last time. If you haven't listened to that interview, I recommend you do that now, but you can certainly listen to this without doing that. Then we're going to talk about 2011 movie Cabin in the Woods, directed by Drew Goddard, also written by Joss Whedon. Not sure if we want to talk about Joss Whedon at all, but maybe we shouldn't, right? So we're going to jump in with The Haunted Mask. We're kind of going all the way back to our childhood introductions to horror with R.L. Stine's books. The Goosebumps series certainly was a big impact on me. Jeff, I know you talked about this before, so we reread The Haunted Mask. What did you think?
I was surprised at how well it holds up, honestly. There were interesting themes there that I wasn't expecting and probably didn't pick up on reading it as an elementary school student. The adults are kind of stupid in these books. I think that appeals to the audience when, you're that younger age group reading these books. But the horror is there. It's palpable. The mask is creepy in the description. It has something Wicked This Way Comes vibes at times. The store where Carly Beth goes into to get the mask with the proprietor who seems very creepy. And if this were a Scooby-Doo episode from like the 60s or 70s.
Looks like we've got another mystery on our hands.
Or a 60s or 70s made-for-TV horror movie, Vincent Price definitely would have played the proprietor with his room of real masks.
I never met a monster I didn't like.
Which obviously every Halloween shop has. The younger brother being a jerk. The sort of two boy bullies in the cafeteria. I mean, it brought back all sorts of elementary school, junior high school vibes for me. And I appreciated how well Stine captures that. But then the horror too, once Carly Beth gets that mask on and then realizes she's kind of no longer in control, but taking on the life of the mask. And then her mom with the paper mache head that she made in the art class. So 90s. I mean, this is something right out of the 90s on a sitcom. I'm surprised it wasn't on like the Reba McEntire show back in the day or something like that, or Everybody Loves Raymond would have had a field day with something like this. The depiction of the parent, because I don't think we ever see Carly Beth's dad, just her mom.
He does come home. So he comes home at the end.
He's on business. That's right.
Which, I don't know, that also was an experience of my childhood. Dad's on the business trip and mom's at home making the costumes or whatever.
Making a paper mache mask. And the bird costume, I mean, I was having flashbacks to The Christmas Story with the bunny rabbit costume, which
It looks like a pink nightmare.
is equally horrific in its way, even though I don't think that it's meant to be in that. Maybe it is in that movie. But yeah, I mean, Brian, your thoughts?
I'm with you. I think that the story's characters felt like childhood. I don't know if that's because I read them when I was a kid and this just made sense to me. But the two bully boys are also their friend, right? It's not as if they're bullies in the sense that, oh, those bullies over there, I can't get away from them. It's like, these are like my best friends and they always scare me. There's something strange about that, but that kind of young, kind of antagonistic relationship, yeah, it feels very real. I think you're right that the mom feels distant, and yet she shows this token of love, making a paper mache copy of her daughter's face, which every daughter, of course, wants their mom to do. How do I know you love me, Mom? You didn't make me a paper mache copy of my face yet, so how do I even know that you love me? There's a couple of things that really stand out to me that were kind of funny. The shopkeeper, he's got slicked back hair, parted in the middle, he's got a pencil-thin mustache, and he's wearing a cape? And you're just like, what? I don't know exactly what trope this is, except that it's all the tropes, like, combine into one of like creepy middle-aged man. But there's also a sense in which, okay, this is a spoiler. I don't know if we need spoiler alerts for Goosebumps books. If you haven't read them, honestly, it's okay.
You could read this book in an hour, literally.
Yes, it's shorter than you remember when you were in 5th grade or whatever. At the end, we find out that the masks were made in his lab, and two things. One, he's some kind of evil genius that now runs a pop-up Halloween costume shop. Like, what? What's happening there? And two, the masks begin to float at the end. This is something that I totally forgot about, but they start to float. And then I just say, what? What is happening? They're floating now. How did that happen? I think you could have gotten a job for the military, guy. Why are you running a Halloween shop? You can make masks float. This is pretty good.
Joke's on you, Brian. He now owns and is the CEO of every Spirit Halloween store.
No, you're right. You're probably right. That guy's probably making a lot of money.
Are you depressed or is it just CAPITALIS?
But I think the thing that I love about these books is that they drive you to turn the page. I did read this to my kids a while ago, and I forgot every chapter is like a cliffhanger. And I love it.
I don't have my original copies anymore. I think they were donated to cousins, friends of friends at some point. I had to download it on my Kindle, and it's still a page turner, but it's more of like a page swiper. It reads remarkably fast. It's a very coherent narrative. Like I just said, it takes about an hour to read the whole thing, but it is really enjoyable. It kind of ends and you're like, oh, that's it? Like, not because like you're unsatisfied with the ending, but it's because you want to read more of it, which I think is how, just from a serial fiction perspective, that's brilliant on Stein's part, because this is how you sell. There's like, what, 60 some Goosebumps books? It seems like every time the Scholastic Book Fair popped back up around the elementary school, there was a new one, and that was the headliner of the little thin paper catalog that you would get a couple weeks before, and you'd go home to your parents and ask for however many dollars it was, or you'd cut the grass, do extra chores, wash the dog. Didn't have a dog, but I assume some folks did.
I think Stein does an interesting job of creating a world, but I think those friendships, as a kind of familiar thing, make it easy for however old you were, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade, reading these things. I was just in Rhode Island recently, and there was a shirt. So there's this store called Parched. It's on Brook Street if you're in Providence. Great stuff. They have it says Providence, but it's in the Goosebumps font. And I was talking to the guy that owns the shop, and he was saying like, yeah, you have to be of a certain age to really know what this is. And I think that's something that's kind of interesting. It's like you and I were pretty close in age, and we were in that sweet spot of the Goosebumps were a huge thing. We talked to Paul Tremblay last week, and he was like, I didn't read them. I'm probably 10 years older than you, and, I'm 20 years old and you're 10 years old. It's going to be weird for me to read Goosebumps. So I think it's worth kind of identifying that Goosebumps hits this one brief moment in time. My kids are reading them. I hope other kids are reading them so that they're still around. But like you and I think we got that kind of nice moment where Goosebumps was really relevant.
Yeah, the original series was 92 to 97, which is prime elementary school, middle school for you and I. 62 books during that time period. But then the series came back up again in 2008. So it seems like it's aimed at a new generation. And it would be interesting to look at some of the newer ones to see what's changed, to see what Stein maybe has integrated into his newer books to speak to this generation of young person compared to us. Like, what does horror look like for Gen Z? Is that what 2008 would be compared to us as geriatric millennials? It's interesting to think about like cultural moments in this way. And from a cultural studies perspective, I wonder how many more of those we will have going forward into the future because of shifting media, because of technology. There was an article that looked at how there are fewer and fewer cultural hallmarks that people share, whether it's Seinfeld back in the early 90s, whether it's the Scream series, since we're a horror podcast, from the late 90s. They don't exist anymore. That sort of shared media consumption is dwindling in 2024.
Yeah. If it is the case that horror is trying to shine a light on anxieties that are going on today, it's interesting to think about how that might happen.
To that end, to what you just said there. So what are the anxieties that we see in the Haunted Mask?
Yeah. Why are we reading Haunted Mask? One, there's this kind of sense of nostalgia. We are looking back at our own horror stories. How did we get into this? But two, this is still relevant today. Paul Tremblay writing horror movie is still talking about masks. And I'm with you in that Carly Beth is in many ways driven by her friends to take on a new mask. And I think that there's a kind of anxiety about when you take on the new mask, she becomes that monster. She can't take it off. Is it the case that we are worried that we are going to get stuck in a personality driven by our friends? We become somebody new and we can't move on. And I think that is an initial connection with horror movie. So I want to hear your thoughts about this. There's a clear connection between the way that Carly Beth is kind of driven into the mask by her friends and the way the Thin Kid is driven into the mask by his group of friends.
That's a really good way to frame it, I think, Brian. Thin Kid is kind of co-opted into being part of this film. He's part of that friend group, but seems like he's sort of on the outskirts of that friend group. Very different way from Carly Beth, right? Carly Beth is motivated by trying to kind of prove to her friends that she's not the scaredy cat. She's not this little pushover, that she can be scary like them. The Thin Kid desperately wants approval. He goes all method acting, which the characters in horror movie talk about. So there is this yearning to belong. Thin Kid seems to not really have an identity outside of this role in the movie, which could explain why he's so taken by the mask. Maybe part of the meta horror we'll talk about is that the mask co-opted Thin Kid's identity. So we don't have a clear before scene or before picture of Thin Kid. All we have is Thin Kid post-mask, and this is how his life has been changed by the mask. In The Haunted Mask, the R.L. Stine book, Carly Beth does have sort of issues getting the mask off of her head. Thin Kid seems to like become the creature that is the mask with the sort of makeup and stuff. So it is an interesting point you're making about identity and belonging and feeling the need to take on a new identity to fit in with a group of people. Because I think that's exactly what we're seeing with Thin Kid.
It feels as though what we're getting with Carly Beth is a desire to be part of the community, be part of the friendship differently. So she wants to join the friend group in a different way. The Thin Kid is the same way. And I think this is really interesting because it happens both in the story of the film and in the story of the book. So if you haven't read Horror Movie, one, I recommend that you do. It's really incredible. But two, You should know that Paul Tremblay is playing with form here. He gives us really two stories. One of them is about a group of friends that make a movie, and the other is the movie itself. So there's a lot of the book is made up of the script. And in the script, we get a character named the Thin Kid, who is driven by his friends to take on some role where he now becomes a kind of monster through the wearing of a mask. One interesting connection with the haunted mask is there are times when Carly Beth says things like, the mask made me do it. She chokes her best friend, which for reading this now, I'm like, you're in the 3rd grade reading this? This is scary. She's choking her best friend, but she says, the mask made me do it. She starts stealing candy from other kids. She starts acting more violently than she otherwise would have. And this is exactly the same thing that happens with the Thin Kid in the movie that happens in the book, but also maybe with the actual character that plays the Thin Kid. And this is where this kind of meta horror kind of starts to come in. So I don't know if you're ready to transition to meta horror, but I think this is exactly where we can get this idea. Paul said he didn't read this book. He didn't read Goosebumps. Makes sense. I think that R.L. Stine is pulling on an already existing horror trope that Paul is also able to pull on and critique, or at least shine a light on, without having read The Haunted Mask. So The Haunted Mask gives us this kind of strange, nostalgic view of it, and Paul gives us a meta horror critique of it. Gonna throw it back to you and see if you have thoughts before we jump into meta horror, or you can take that as a jumping point into meta horror.
I think we can jump into meta horror. I'll just add that masks have been cultural signs of horror throughout history. A very broad statement. I would definitely mark that with a red pen if this were a composition essay. But yeah, we see them in rituals. We see them every Halloween. I mean, think about how many horror movies include characters with masks. Michael Myers in Halloween. Freddy Krueger's face is disfigured, so like it's a mask of sorts. Scream. I forget what they call the mask, but the spooky ghost face mask. Ghost face, that's the word? Yeah, ghost face. Scooby-Doo. We mentioned Scooby-Doo once already, but there's always somebody behind a mask. So masks allow folks to operate almost with anonymity, taking on a different identity, becoming something that they're not. And so Tremblay commenting on this in horror movie as meta horror is really fruitful, really fecund sort of ground for us to investigate here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm going to throw in something that I've been thinking about for a long time. So I'm going to call out Emmanuel Levinas here. That's a phenomenologist, a Jewish philosopher who's working kind of 1930s. And one thing that he talks about is the ethics of the face. I'm going to go through this very quickly, so bear with me here. When you encounter somebody else, you are responsible to that other person because of the way that you see them as another fully formed being. The mask is interesting, especially in these slashers, because I think that it kind of hides that sense, and you never fully develop into this kind of person who's able to take up the other as something that is worthy of my respect, worthy of my ethical consideration, worthy of not being a victim of my own action. And so when I put on the mask, when Carly Beth puts on the mask, when the Thin Kid puts on the mask, or Michael Myers or whoever, all these Scooby-Doo characters, they are able to kind of hide themselves away and never get to the point where they see the other person as worthy of respect. And again, I think this is important because I think what Paul Tremblay is doing in horror movie is trying to highlight how we as the audience is in some way expecting that. So I got that a lot with the horror script. I didn't know if you had any of that kind of experience reading horror movie, that what you're doing is you're kind of evaluating yourself as a horror fan. You know what you want to happen. You know what you're expecting. And in order for the story to be satisfying for you, it needs to have some kind of elements, and then you have to stop and think, oh no, I wanted that person to die? This is weird. What am I doing here?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, particularly in light of our discussion with Paul last episode, but also discussions you and I have had on camera, off camera, recorded, unrecorded. I still don't know how I feel about the ending of horror movie. There's something about my expectation for how that was supposed to end, given the way Paul set it up, that those expectations were not met. And I don't think my expectations were for what happens to happen. Are we allowed to give spoilers? Like, can we talk about what happens?
Spoiler alert here. I don't know. Yeah.
But he eats the kid, right?
Yeah, there's this moment where his jaw like expands or something and he just swallows him whole.
He swallows the actor who is playing Thin Kid in the remake of horror movie. I didn't expect that to happen. Maybe because I am now the middle-aged person who thinks adults will act more responsibly than that. Maybe this is another interesting tie-in with The Haunted Mask, where adults really aren't acting responsibly. But my expectations at the end of horror movie were not met. And it's something I struggled with when I was reflecting on the novel as a whole, because I really like the novel. And I think you're exactly right that it is playing to our expectations as fans of horror. But then at the end, I think Paul takes it almost a step too far. And then in doing so, makes us question, holy crap, what have I been asking for this entire time? Why have I been kind of team monster in this case? And I say that as someone who is unabashedly, see also episode 2 of Horror Joy, Team Jaws.
I think that's a good point. And I think you're right. And when we're confronted with something that doesn't meet our expectations, we kind of have to ask, what were we expecting to begin with and why didn't it meet those? I think there's something interesting about the ending too, because the thin kid has expressed so many times that there's this kind of anxiety about becoming older and the way that his body looks as the thin kid. And he then consumes the younger generation with his anxieties in some way. And to call back to Carly Beth, to call back to Haunted Mask, the adults are not there, but is it the case that those kids are already playing out some kind of anxiety given to them by a generation before them? So that what we are ending up with in Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay is this sense in which we're just stuck, we're consumed by the anxieties, the worries, the frustrations, the fears, all of that of generations before us. And we don't get the perspective of the young actor to like say, oh, I want to break out of this. Let's do something different. But there might be something there, which also might be a good way to transition into something like Cabin in the Woods, which feels as though, as we said in the introduction, is offering a kind of genre apocalypse. It's attempting to critique the genre and say, we don't want what has been given to us already. Let's do something different. Let's shed some of those historical tropes and maybe move on. How do we do that? So again, Jeff, not sure if you're ready to move on. Thoughts before we do that? Or we can jump into talking about Cabin in the Woods in relation to the meta-horror conversation we're having about Paul Tremblay's Horror Movie.
Some thoughts, I think, about horror movies still, and maybe The Haunted Mask with what you're saying about the generations prior to us being reflected in the horror that we're experiencing, or the horror that we're writing, or the horror that we're expecting. But I want to save that, I think, until after we talk about Cabin in the Woods, and then we can think about all three of these maybe in that way. Cabin in the Woods, I rewatched it because it had been since 2011, 2012, when I had last seen it. It's very much a movie of that time period. I think it's great how in The Engineers in the lab underground, where we see the live footage of their closed circuit television of other international horror sites that fit right into all of the different horror genres that started hitting movie theaters in the early 2000s. There's one in Sweden, there's one in Japan. You get to see that sort of horror that we were all introduced to as Americans in the early 2000s, when the sort of slasher film had sort of been run to its penultimate degree with Scream in the late 90s. But yeah, once we get to this film, there's that strange mixture of comedy, given the engineers in the underground lab, underground shelter headquarters for this whole experiment. They're comedic actors, and they're kind of inept too. Like, that's the sense I get anyway, where these two guys are like, oh, you know, we failed upward this far. Let's keep going. What could possibly go wrong? And then you have these American college students on this trip to the cabin in the woods. They're going on vacation. They're in an RV. Each character is kind of a trope. You have the stoner, you have the jock, who also is apparently kind of smart. It comes back to what you were saying earlier about thinking about the limits of horror and how far can horror go and what can horror do? Or maybe have we reached a moment of reckoning in horror as a genre where we need to reconsider what horror does? I think Cabin in the Woods does that really well. I don't know that it gets the credit for doing that in some ways. It's clear that Joss Whedon, for all of his problems, and Goddard, who co-write it and who directs it, are really thinking about how horror is working, what horror is doing. Culturally, I'm trying to think about what's going on in the late 2000s. We're in the first Obama presidency term. We're in the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're post-2008 housing crisis, Occupy Wall Street's going on. So there's a lot of cultural unrest, but there's a lot of feeling of not belonging, which seems to be like a kind of a sub-thread throughout this episode so far, where this idea of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And Cabin in the Woods puts together these characters who, frankly, just don't belong together.
I think what you're saying is really important in that we get the 5 archetypes of horror cinema, at least this type of horror cinema. Yeah, we get the jock, the nerd, the fool, who's the stoner, and we get the horror and the virgin. But I think what's really interesting about these characters in Cabin in the Woods is that they are not typically those characters.
We are not who we are.
At one point, one of the characters kind of looks around and says, why is this person acting like that? And Marty, the stoner character played by Fran Kranz, he goes, right, like, this shouldn't be happening. We are not who we are. And I think that that's important because they, as a group of friends, are shoved into this scenario and into acting in a way that they probably would otherwise not act. The archetype of the horror at the beginning says that she just changed her hair color. This is, again, atypical, but we find out that this is kind of engineered by the people behind this whole spectacle. And so again, belonging is already a meta horror concept because these 5 people are pushed into belonging to the stereotypes in which they're supposed to play out. And they maybe don't. The virgin is not actually a virgin. You know, the jock is also supposed to be really smart. Again, they're kind of pushed into these roles. So I think that's important. I do think that there's something interesting about the frame story. So one, I just want to say that I would personally watch Bradley Whitford, who is the guy who is in Billy Madison. I would watch him in anything. I think he's hilarious, and he's hilarious in this again, too. But 2 things pop out. One, even in this story, of course, we're given a horror story. What's at the foundation of this movie is that there are some kind of ancient monsters that are about to rise up unless they get their fill of this kind of weird reality TV show that involves these sacrifices. And 2, there are these prayers that they pray.
This we offer in humility and fear.
When people die.
As it ever was.
As it ever was.
And so I do think that the relationship between comedy and horror is really done well because there are moments when Bradley Whitford is being Bradley Whitford, and at one point he's like lamenting the sacrifice and the suffering, and then somebody with tequila comes in and immediately he's like, oh, tequila. But the prayers that they pray to the gods that are the foundation, I think also showcase that there's some kind of reverence going on here for the powers that could undermine everything that's going on. So those are the thoughts that I had about those kind of archetypes. I wanted to ask you, and I'm hoping we get a medieval alert here.
Consult the Book of Armament.
Because a while ago, a long time ago, you told me that the word wood is etymologically related to madness. And it seems like this plays out in a lot of horror films, whether we're talking about actual mental illness or some kind of understanding of madness that's just a cartoonish version. But curious if you had thoughts about Cabin in the Woods as a kind of cabin where we enter into a kind of madness.
Yeah, it's curious, right? Because who's to say, sort of asking them whether Goddard and Whedon are aware of this sort of etymological link. So the etymological link that I've talked about before, in Old English, the word wold can mean either woods, which is to say like a copse, gathering of trees, the forest, sort of, but it can also mean madness. So if someone has gone wold, if they've entered into madness. What's really interesting in medieval literature, particularly once you get into the romances, like the Arthurian stuff where there's knights running around, is when characters go into the woods, they are often driven into the woods by madness, or they experience madness while they're in the woods. It's like the Upside Down, where things are all topsy-turvy. And like this gets echoed throughout a bunch of different texts, a bunch of different movies we can think about throughout at least Western history. So The Hobbit, when you think about Mirkwood, the woods are always kind of dangerous in Tolkien's sort of Lord of the Rings landscape, Chronicles of Narnia. Unsurprising, given both Tolkien and Lewis are medievalists by training. The horror genre, though, going into the woods are somehow unsafe. This probably plays into witches and the idea of witches living out in the woods by themselves, hermits, all of these people who decide to go out into the woods and not be part of society, to sort of leave community, are in some way self-ostracizing, but also by definition then ostracized from the group they once were a part of. We see this in The Village, M. Night Shyamalan. He might be playing on that a bit, maybe one of his last good movies. Yeah, so Cabin in the Woods, there's no real reason they're going into the woods other than they're going on a vacation, and it seems that they're just drawn to this place like it was set up for them. The only thing we're missing is some mysterious invitation that they got. Actually, maybe we're not missing it because it's someone's cousin's cabin or a weird person who's not part of the movie, somehow related, that has told them to go here on vacation. Once you get into the woods, though, you talked about the prayers, the incantations they're using, and the ancient temple, and the blood rites, and of course it's Latin.
Do not read the Latin.
So we bring Latin back into the picture.
Super vivo caro.
Where anytime we need to talk about witchcraft or human sacrifice or anything that is a little bit supernatural in its way, we have to use Latin to signal that. So I think that for sure is Goddard and Whedon playing with these horror tropes, playing with meta horror in the idea that if something's scary, obviously we're going to use a foreign language that most of our viewing audience won't understand. We've talked about this in previous episodes. The religious horror, episode 3, Welsh pops up. And I think as mostly probably monolingual viewers in the United States, that is a way of aurally, A-U-R-A-L-L-Y, discomfiting an audience because they don't understand what they're hearing on the screen. So there's something there too with Latin being used, being summoned, maybe is again as a way of commenting on horror, commenting on the occult, commenting on lizard people. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in that episode on religious horror, you talked about the medieval time as a kind of consummate other. We can fill in whatever we want, and we often fill in with things that actually are pretty false. But it also is, or was, maybe still is, right, a mechanism of power. We don't want you to know the full words, and so we, the Catholic Church, are going to keep the Mass in Latin, etc. Right? So there is this kind of sense of power that we can get from Latin, which again is the invocation that initially brings about the horror in Cabin in the Woods. I think that's important. As an environmental philosopher, I do also want to point out that I think that there's a relationship between culture, or the city, and nature, or the woods, where we often have this dualism that sees the woods or nature as irrational. We want the mind on one side, the body on the other. The irrational stuff is what we push away. Again, we got that in religious horror, but here again, there's this sense in which going into the woods is madness. It's irrational. But on the other hand, right, this meta horror stuff comes back right at us and says, no, this is rational because this is scripted. We did this on purpose.
If you guys treat this like a setup, I'm going to have no fun at all.
This was fully thought out, and we have an idea exactly what's going to happen moving forward. And so we're playing with this tension. We're playing with this idea that one thing is madness and one is not, when in fact this is planned.
To that point, Brian, I think I'll just add, it's so scripted, it's so planned that they have a wheel they spin to decide what trope attacks the 5 college students here. And it's the Buckners, this sort of zombie family that comes back and is very much part Texas Chainsaw, part Deliverance, part Evil Dead. There's a lot of horror movies being alluded to in the Buckners here with these dead zombies that are coming to attack them and kill them. So I love the idea that there's a wheel they're spinning to sort of decide these things.
Well, there's the basement, right, that they have to go into, and the choices that they make are what lead them to the monster that is revealed for them. I think the wheel is are they betting on this, or is
Nope, you're right. That's the betting.
Because at one point, the engineers or the showrunners, maybe, they are saying they have to make the choice.
No, they have to make the choice of their own free will.
Or else they can't be punished.
Otherwise, the system doesn't work.
But it's unclear why they're actually being punished. Interestingly, I think the director who comes in later says that they're being punished for being young, and that this is a trope that keeps happening over and over again. We've had this since ancient times. There's a punishment of some youthful group of people. And again, I think that there's something here at a meta horror level that is critical of the roles that we have to play. So again, going back to maybe Carly Beth, going back to the thin kid being pushed into a role by maybe the anxieties of an older generation, is it the case that what we're getting is these 5 people being pushed in to roles that they don't identify with anymore. And this is where maybe Gen Z has taken up this kind of, I don't know, this project and said, nope, we're not doing that anymore. We're gonna push back. And maybe, of course, other generations have done this. Paul talked about Gen X as being a very, he's a very kind of punk-oriented Gen X person. All that to say, this is a kind of opportunity to push back and say, no, I don't want to do that. And in fact, Marty the Fool at one point says, civilization, you know what we should do? We should just break it.
Society needs to crumble.
And again, spoiler, this is a 2011 movie. If you haven't seen it, stop here. But at the end, that's exactly what they do. They allow for the apocalypse to happen. They do not fulfill the roles, and they say, you know what? Humanity, let's do something different. Let's move on. And I'm curious what you thought or read into that part of it. They're basically saying, like, look, we need to break the system. I'll give you just one thing that it made me think of, right? People say things like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than change. Is that where we're getting here?
I'm not sure. This movie for me is difficult to read intention given the mixture of horror and comedy. I do think that if the fool is the person that we are turning to who says, let's just break it and see what happens, I think that speaks volumes, that it's the fool that's the person that we are turning to figure out what we should do with our future. And on one hand, like, that seems not great. On the other hand, as an audience perspective, watching this movie and thinking about these sort of powers that be pulling the strings with this intergenerational conflict, I think we kind of are team fool with Marty. Thinking back to horror movie, thinking back to The Haunted Mask, I think in The Haunted Mask, you see Carly Beth being subjected to this intergenerational expectations, where we talked earlier about the 2 boys who are their friends, but also the antagonists. This very much smacks of like the 1950s, the 1960s, where, oh, those prepubescent boys, they're just acting that way because they like that little girl. There's not really a threat there. She's just sort of like personally unfulfilled, which maybe that's the intergenerational conflict where she's deciding, I don't want to be this type. I want to show that I can be scary as a girl too. Horror movie, the thin kid feels like he doesn't belong, feels like he has to take on this role. I mean, speaking to Paul's generation, that's kind of Gen X's story. Gen X is the most put upon generation of people. Gen X is often this group of counterculture, punk. We don't want to do what our parents are telling us, our parents being the boomers. But it is curious to see then that sort of intergenerational conflict in horror movie, because I really think that the thin kid is a great representation of that sort of Gen X perspective where he doesn't fit in. He doesn't know what to do. So he's going to embrace and lean into the counterculture, which is to say, being the monster. He is going to be the monster and he's going to fulfill expectations, exceed expectations. I mean, even the method acting part is like so very much that. And then once you get to Cabin in the Woods, very much a millennial perspective with the world's already kind of screwed. Let's just let it blow up if we're going to go with the fool. That seems to be his perspective, right?
It's time to give someone else a chance.
Seems to be a lot of friends I have who are my same age, a lot of people who I read who are also millennials, do have this not quite conspiracy theory, but probably there's enough objective evidence to prove that there are people who are just pulling the strings and the powers that be, and the rest of us are kind of the puppets. So yeah, the intergenerational point you're making here is maybe the meta commentary that we're seeing as a through line throughout all of these. Thoughts on that?
I think that's right. I think that there is this kind of push and pull. And something that Paul talked about in the interview was this idea that horror is a kind of, it's on the outside, right? It's going to nag at the mainstream culture and it's going to push it. And I think that's important because every generation that comes up is always going to push the previous generation. And how do we manage the anxiety of that transition? I think we are dealing with that right now in the United States for sure. How do we deal with the transition from an older generation to a newer generation? Presidential elections are coming up. This is a huge storyline. I think it's important because it remains an anxiety for us now. And maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is what Goddard and Whedon were really able to get to, is that this worry that we're just repeating ourselves over and over again is a significant worry. Maybe it always has been, but it's certainly a worry now. What do? Are we willing to blow it up? And maybe this is the kind of last point that I want to make, is that I read The Cabin in the Woods as a kind of trolley problem for utilitarian ethics.
I can only imagine your pain.
So if you go all the way back, if you took this kind of class, if you didn't, that's okay, to your introduction to philosophy class, and you were introduced to the trolley problem. The basic idea of utilitarian ethics is that we want to maximize the good and minimize the bad.
What's happening to you is part of something bigger.
Some people simplify this, but here in Cabin in the Woods, what we get is this sense in which what you have to do is to sacrifice yourself or your friend for the good of the whole world.
It's our task to placate the ancient ones.
If you don't do that, then the world will crumble.
As it's yours to be offered up to them.
You along with it. You have to make the choice to sacrifice yourself. And again, here we are. Is it the case that we're asking for a genre apocalypse, a economic apocalypse, cultural apocalypse? We say we want something new. We want to blow it up. We don't want capitalism anymore. We don't want your old version of politics anymore. We want something new. And to do that, how do we get there? I think Goddard and Whedon give us this sense in which you have to blow it up. I'm not necessarily convinced, but I think there's something in there. Even if that's not what they're giving us, that's certainly an anxiety. Do you have to sacrifice your own good for the sake of the thing that's always worked? Do you have to sacrifice your satisfaction in life for the continuation of capitalism, the American way of life? Do you have to sacrifice future generations for your own comfort? What is it, right? I think there's a kind of interesting but simple ethical analogy going on in Cabin in the Woods that is also pulling on that kind of meta-horror stuff.
It is interesting to consider how the horror might be working in Cabin in the Woods in that way, where there is the older generation, maybe the people running things in the lab, in the underground networks across the world, who have the expectation that the younger generation will just follow orders and sacrifice themselves in order to save for the greater good, if you will. Whereas the actual characters involved in the movie don't want to do that. They don't want to sacrifice themselves for others, for really an unseen other, for a part of a community they might not even realize they're a part of. That is horror intergenerationally, for sure. In addition to that, I want to go back to, if you don't mind, the concept we introduced in the cold open of post-horror, where this movie, to me, in many ways, shows all of the characteristics of post-horror. And David Church, in his book, does in fact go on to talk about Cabin in the Woods a little bit. The bigger ramifications, I think, are what you're talking about, where like this intergenerational, these ethical considerations. But from a meta-commentary, just as a genre commentary, I think we see that too in this movie, where the self-awareness that we see, the meta elements, where what's supposed to happen in the stereotypical plot of a horror movie gets undone. We see behind the scenes. We maybe, like you mentioned with horror movie, have to question our own expectations. What were we hoping for? What did we expect to happen? Did we want all of these college students to die so that the monster that is somewhere underground is contained or is appeased, whatever blood god it might be? With The Haunted Mask, our expectations are really not about horror, but about resolution, where Carly Beth gets out of the horror. Coming back to what I said earlier in this episode, maybe that's my problem with horror movie, where I was expecting some sort of resolution to the problem, and Tremblay doesn't give us that resolution. That's part of the horror, I would say. Cabin in the Woods doesn't give us that resolution. The world ends. We don't know what's happening other than Sigourney Weaver shows up and gives us some information that's cryptic in its way. So, Brian, any thoughts on how this works as post-horror, how maybe we are moving into, like you said, that Gen Z doesn't share these values anymore, doesn't have this sort of cultural shared norms or whatever, and then they're going to push back against this process, these tropes that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of me that really hope so. I think that in many ways, I roll my eyes at horror films that look as though they're just repeating the same thing again. So I read this article by Christopher Woofter, who I really like as a scholar, called Watchers in the Woods. It's about the cabin in the woods, and I think he makes some really interesting points. One of them is that it seemed as though Goddard and Whedon were really looking at horror remakes as something that they wanted to push back against. That this was, in many ways, the epitome of the tired tropes of horror. And I think we're still dealing with that. I know you saw The First Omen.
You don't have to be afraid. God has great plans for you.
The Exorcism has come up again. We're getting reboots of old slasher films. How many times are we going to remake Halloween? These kinds of things feel really tired to me. And I could be wrong, and I'm happy to hear from you. Send us an email, comment on our Instagram page, whatever it is. But I feel tired when I see these same things happening over and over again. I think this is really why I'm unexcited by a lot of things that, for example, and here again, sorry folks, James Wan puts out, Blumhouse puts out. I watched the trailer for Afraid, a movie about AI, which is certainly something that we need to talk about, and it just looks really boring. There are exciting movies that have come out and continue to come out. Things like Jordan Peele's suite of films that he's put out, especially Get Out. That came out, I think that was a new kind of take on an old problem, but still allowed us to kind of rethink things. And so I'm excited about these ideas as they play out in horror. There's some comfort in the structure of horror that people take, in the kind of predictability. For me, I would prefer that there was I don't want horror to go away, and I don't think it ever will, but I like this sense in which we're disrupting the norms. I think the problem is that in doing so, it feels as though we're kind of stuck in that, sorry folks, Hegelian dialectic.
And here come the Germans now, led by their skipper, Nobby Hagel.
Where we're just repeating. We just repeat the same things over again, but in new ways. And so one question that Woofter specifically brings up is really whether or not Cabin in the Woods is doing anything new. It's certainly, as a meta-horror film, it's shining a light on the tropes that we're used to. It also, in many ways, explains the tropes. Why are there werewolves? Why are there these things? There's some, library of monsters that's being deployed.
Nightmares, huh?
Okay, fine. But does this actually do anything to disrupt? Or has Cabin in the Woods just kind of reinforced all of those stereotypes that we had before, except that it leaves us with a world that has, in fact, ended? I love this idea of post-horror. I think it's helpful. And as the article, I think, identifies, this is not a post in the sense that it's after horror, right? We're not going to move beyond horror, but it's a kind of moving forward, a transgression of what was previously, something that we can take up in a different mode. And I think that is really exciting. I think it's really exciting. And Paul's use of different formats, films using kind of experimental things, I think that's something that's interesting, something that's needed, something that I'm personally excited by.
I like all of what you're saying here. It makes me think about, if we take this conversation even a step further in the meta with what we're doing with this podcast, which is trying to explore, as we say at the start of every episode, the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. Again, you all can send us your hate mail about James Wan and sort of jump scare movies and reviving the zombified corpses of horror franchises over and over and over again just to make a quick buck, which is maybe my cynical take on it. But I don't find horror compelling if there's not something intellectual there to enjoy. And maybe I sound like a stodgy, stick in the mud stereotype of a professor who ruins everything by overthinking everything that I watch and everything that I read. And that's not always the case. I read a lot of stuff that's kind of just pure crap, and I watch a lot of stuff that's pure crap just for comfort. Now, I don't always analyze everything like this, but if I care about something like horror, this genre, I want to think about it. I want to think about what it's doing. Part of the critique of meta horror, Brian, you and I have talked about this a little bit in getting ready for this episode, and then also what Church talks about in post horror, is maybe considering a critique of the audience. What is it the audience wants? And are we just catering to an audience who doesn't want to think? And listen, there's nothing wrong with escapism. I love some good escapism. Fantasy literature can be great for escapism, but if it's good fantasy literature, it's also going to make you think about what it's critiquing, what needs to be escaped from. Again, going to reference C.S. Lewis for the second time in this episode with the Chronicles of Narnia. There's, of course, the religious allegory there, but there's also very much an allegory of Britain post World War II, thinking about what does it mean to exist in this space from, again, a very blinkered sort of white, cis, heterosexual perspective. But, that aside, it is sort of entertaining that idea. I think if audiences were going into theaters with the expectation of having to think in horror movies, or really any movie for that matter, you would see a lot of the films that A24 puts out, that Neon puts out, not getting completely blasted in like the Rotten Tomatoes review and rating. They always have really poor reviews compared to what the critics have. But I think to get back to the question of genre, maybe what Goddard and Whedon are pointing towards here, maybe what Church is pointing to in post-horror, maybe what you're talking about with some other critiques of Cabin in the Woods, thinking about does it succeed at what it's trying to do, makes you think of a different genre that we're not going to talk about in this podcast, but comedy. Comedy films, there aren't many that are released anymore in theaters that are actual just early 2000s, Adam Sandler, Will Ferrell, Wayans brothers comedy. It's either a dramedy or it's a rom-com or there's something else added to it. So there has been a death of a genre there. And I don't think we're seeing that with horror, but I do think we're seeing this tension of people wanting to move horror in a new direction, like Jordan Peele, like what we see through A24, like what we see in Neon, versus, again, like The Conjuring was fine in its way, but like James Wan is just doing the same stupid jump scares in movie after movie after movie. Or it's worse, it's torture porn. It's something like Saw. I just watched A Violent Nature and I had really high expectations for it based on some of the hype around it. And it's perfectly fine, but it's torture porn. It's just like, how can we gruesomely destroy bodies in front of people? And it's a Cabin in the Woods credit. They don't really fixate on that. Like there's some interesting horror deaths to be sure, and they're kind of tropey in their ways, but that's not the purpose. That's not the goal of the film. And so, yeah, I kind of went off in some different directions there, Brian, but I just think what you're asking about here with what's this film doing and where is horror as a genre in film at the moment, these are important questions I think we're going to come up against again and again and again in this podcast.
Yeah, I think it gets to the question. How do we find joy in horror? What are we doing here? And if it's just, and this is just for me, right? This is, I think, maybe even the argument that we're making. If it's simply that we're watching other people suffer, we are smack dab in the middle of the critique that Cabin in the Woods gives. Are you willing to watch somebody suffer to perpetuate the good, the pleasure of a person? Personally, that's not where I'm finding joy. We can find maybe sadistic pleasure there or something else. The joy here comes from this sense in which, one, we're collectively drawn to an understanding of what's going on in the world. Like he's saying, we highlight the horror of the world. We highlight what we're running from or escaping from in order to shine a light on it. Now we're together. Something that I loved about the Goosebumps books and that I liked about horror movie is that there's this sense in which there's a group of friends working together to do something. Maybe we're all just Carly Beth and the Thin Kid. Maybe we are just these 5 people that want to go to the Cabin in the Woods and we want to get together. For me, I find joy talking to you, Jeff, talking to other people about horror, taking up these common stories, this imagined community, these imagined worlds. And every one of these that we've talked about today does this thing. It says, here's the world, and I'm going to leave you thinking about it. The edges of the story that I've told you are just the beginning. And you now take up the world. What happened to Carly Beth's brother? What happened at the end of Cabin in the Woods? What really happened with the Thin Kid? Right? All of these things are perpetuating me to expand my world, which then finds its way back into my understanding of the world. So a couple of things that happen in a horror movie that I think are really insightful. We get this sense in which art, we talked about this with Paul, art is something that we find meaning in maybe afterwards. So we're finding, this is the joy of finding meaning together. That's what I think the joy we can take at a very basic level here. But there's also these places in which, again, I think there's something insightful about this meta horror critique that Paul Tremblay is offering in horror movie where, so at one point we're looking at these posters in one of the characters' walls. So here's a quote from the book. The terrible ones are predictable. They follow a pattern and they make her feel safe, but in an unsafe way. Horror movies should make us feel the opposite, shouldn't they? The question, I think part of what we're asking is when we watch horror movies, what are we looking for? Do we want to feel unsafe? Maybe, right? That's that magic circle aspect of it. But I think there's a sense in which we want to see the world as unsafe in hopes of taking up the project of making it better for those for whom it's the most unsafe. So if we take up the project of horror as identifying, amplifying, expanding, highlighting all the anxieties of our time, can we do that in the way that it allows us to think for the people that are being harmed the most? And I think that's something that's really important, something maybe Jordan Peele does. We'll talk about queer horror more explicitly later in the season. But again, I think that's the joy of taking up the project together. And when we're left with just jump scares and little thought behind it, then we're just left with broken bodies. And for me, I'm out. I want the joy of working together, of joining communities and sure, maybe we're stodgy professors. We ruin everything. But listen, I'm going to laugh at all the weed jokes in Cabin in the Woods.
My parents are going to think I'm such a burnout.
And enjoy it on that level too. So yeah, I love what you're saying. I think personally, this is where I find joy.
I agree. Second to everything you said, there is something about in horror where at the end of the movie, we can either restore the status quo or we can offer something new and refreshing. And in something like Cabin in the Woods, for its failings, it does at least offer us something new, something different, something that's potentially refreshing.
Maybe it's time for a change.
And to me, when horror works well, when it is actively and actually critiquing something, there is that opportunity at the end, rather than just, hey, everything's back to normal, because maybe normal's actually not where we want to be.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is Cabin in the Woods the best movie? No. Did it offer us an opportunity to say, well, let's rethink some of the horror cliches and the horror tropes? Yeah, and I think it does do a good job of the line between horror and comedy as well. So we'll continue to recommend this movie, and I still think it's an enjoyable watch. All right, let's wrap up. So what did we do today? We revisited our love of Goosebumps, a little trip down memory lane for some of us in a specific generation. But we also connected that to the masks that are being offered in horror movie. And we talked about the meta horror that is clearly on display in horror movie. It's asking us questions as the audience. What are we expecting? And I think that perhaps more than any other film in the last 15 years, Cabin in the Woods does exactly that as a meta horror film. It says, what are the horror tropes? What are we expecting in horror? What's tired? And do we need a horror genre apocalypse? And I think we found joy there. Hopefully you found some joy. Jeff, any final words?
No, I think that sums it up. I think we did find some joy in considering a horror genre apocalypse.
All right. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.